right through the top of the storm.
Listen, keep everybody in their seats, no exceptions, all right?
Getting everyone to have their seatbelts securely fastened.
Come on, did you really think I was going to let a movie with the title Plane go by without it getting its own Hollywood versus reality?
Well, it looks like they're pushing us through weather.
Of course they are.
Gentlemen, let's see. 119, 14 passengers, everything cleared. Any questions?
Yeah, looks like we're pushing through some serious weather. It's converging here over the South China Sea.
We're aware of it. By the time you get there, it should have moved inland.
What if it sits there and stews? We could push out east, come north over Luzon.
That adds an hour and 18K in fuel. The flight's nearly empty, so we need to shorten. Take it to 37. You'll clear that weather. Good flight. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Do our iPads control the weather like his does? There you go.
So the first thing in here that is not very Hollywood is the fact that this management person comes in and is talking to them about how he wants them to do the flight. And then after they leave, then there's sarcastic comments between the pilots. That is very real. That happens in real life all the time. What is not realistic and is very Hollywood, though, is the pilots wearing their hat on the flight deck. Normally, as soon as a pilot would get into the flight deck like this, they would actually take their hats off. You will rarely ever see pilots wearing their hat when they're seated up there. As a general rule, if I were to get up onto the flight deck and see that the other pilot up there was sitting up there with their hat, unless they were very new and just confused about the speed that everything was moving at, I would be thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be a very long day. There are certain people that would wear their hats up there. They tend to have a personality type that would possibly be difficult to work with. I've never seen it, but there are a few people that I would suspect if I were to fly with them that they would be one of these people that would be wearing their hats. Anyways, it's not very common. I've never actually gone up to the flight deck and seen someone wearing a hat, even though at my airline now we don't wear hats. I was at an airline that did wear hats, so even there I didn't even see that, but it will happen from time to time, and they are difficult people to fly with. The next thing I want to bring up is you typically don't see these types of guys coming up on the flight deck like this to give a briefing. Now, I'm speaking about in the US, it may happen in other airlines. Those people in the US are typically going to be referred to as dispatchers. Your dispatchers are your person on the ground that typically works with the crew to make sure that we have a safe flight, that we have enough gas, that the airports we're going to go to are going to work for us. While we're in flight, we have the ability to send them text messages from our plane. If there's a problem that we run into, they're the person that's on the ground there that will do everything for us that we need. Make a phone call, find another airport that has good weather. Because they have a computer, they can quickly access all that information. You typically won't have your dispatcher coming to your plane like that because a dispatcher is working on numerous flights at the same time. The time they would spend to walk all the way there to talk to you and then maybe have to walk to the other side of the airport to talk to somebody else, it's not realistic. They're usually at your home base of wherever your airline is based at, and you can communicate with them either via regular phone. If you're in the air, you can do a satellite call to them, or you can just do text messages. But they're your person on the ground that is always going to be helping you to safely conduct your flight. And they're typically not going to say things like this.
Take it to 37. You'll clear that weather. Good flight. Happy New Year.
And no pilot is ever going to be cool with that. The dispatchers are there to help you and plan everything out. But in this situation, I'd say 99% of the time, the pilots are going to say, no, we're absolutely not doing that. Give us the extra gas. If we don't need it, then fine. But if we will need it, then we don't have a problem. You do lose something when you take a bunch of extra fuel like that. There's kind of a rule of thumb that goes in. When you're hauling that fuel, you burn extra fuel. So it's kind of like not ideal to haul a lot of extra fuel if you don't need to because you're burning fuel unnecessarily. But in this situation where there's a bunch of weather that's in the route, the dispatcher is not just going to say, oh, just go above it. They'll give you what they call contingency fuel. And a lot of dispatchers will go in some airlines. At my airline, they're usually really good about this. They'll give you extra fuel in case there's a problem. Some airlines will run pilots really thin, and the pilots have to fight back and forth with the dispatchers and say, hey, no, I don't want to have this situation where we might have to divert, because at the end of the day, the pilots are up there. If they have to go a long way, this guy said like an hour and change to go around the storm, they're not going to be able to do that and then safely make it to their destination. So they'd have to divert, go to another airport, land, get more fuel, continue the flight. And the passengers don't want that. The airline doesn't want that. It costs them a lot of extra money as well. So the pilots in this case are typically going to say, no, we're not going to accept that. So again, this is pretty Hollywood. This is something I just pulled off of the internet here. You can see most flight plans have a line like this right here. which is for contingency fuel. Again, that fuel is there just in case something goes wrong going around weather. Maybe you have a volcano explode while you're flying. There's a bunch of reasons, a bunch of scenarios in which you might use that. The airline does lose money by hauling that fuel around, but they'll lose a lot more if you have to divert. So far, everything except the pilots being snarky after the management person leaves or the dispatcher leaves. Other than those things, pretty much everything in here so far is Hollywood.
Trailblazer 119, you're clear to taxi runway 02 left.
Trailblazer 119, roger that. Taxiing runway 02 left. This is one view that never gets old.
Trailblazer 119 in position, ready for takeoff.
Trailblazer 119, you are cleared for takeoff. Maintain runway heading, climb 2 and maintain 2000.
Roger that. Cleared for takeoff. Fly runway heading. Climb and maintain 2000. Trailblazer 119.
Takeoff power is set. Airspeed alive. 80. Cross checks. 90. 100. 110. 120. V1. Rotate.
Positive rate. Landing gear up.
Landing gear up. Flaps up. Flaps up.
Trailblazer 119, turn right heading 160 degrees. Climb 2 and maintain 10,000.
Copy departure. Trailblazer 119.
First, I'm not going to address just how poor the phraseology is between the pilots and air traffic control here, but let's go with that it's not right at all. That's not how it's supposed to sound like. There are pilots and there are controllers that will talk like that, but it's not right. But I'm not going to get into all the details of the way they should say it, but it's just not right. But something that also doesn't make sense is this taxi instruction here.
Trailblazer 119, you're clear to taxi runway 02 left.
Trailblazer 119, roger that. Taxiing runway 02 left.
You can get a clearance to taxi to a runway, and those clearances are going to be different taxiways to get you to that runway, but you won't get a clearance to taxi onto a runway. You're either cleared onto a runway, or you get clearance to taxi to a runway, but you don't get a clearance that says taxi to runway, or taxi onto runway 02 left. It's just kind of weird the way they worded it. That is not realistic at all. And the other thing that's not realistic is this. Look here at the first officer. You can see that he has his chart up, but he has all this dangerous weather they're about to fly into. While the pilots are on the ground, they are using their taxi charts. They do have an iPad, at least most pilots now have an iPad, but they'll have a taxi chart up because they want to make sure as they're taxiing, one pilot is driving the plane, taxiing it. The other pilot is looking at his chart to verify that they are going the direction they're supposed to go. So you wouldn't be looking at this bad weather because at this stage, that's not a problem. Right now, you're just worried about getting correctly and safely to the runway. So that's very Hollywood. Something that is not Hollywood, and I don't think they even intended to do this, but if a pilot lined up on what he thought was a runway and said this,
This is one view that never gets old.
then I would absolutely be looking at them like this. Because the colored lights on the side of this taxiway are not the correct lights for a runway. Basically, it looks like they're on some abandoned road somewhere with some random lights on the side of the road because there are no markings anywhere on that runway. And when you get onto a runway, there's a bunch of markings on that runway, and there's a bunch of different light colors on that runway, and they mean something to us as pilots. We're going to verify that we're on the right runway. So if I were to line up to a runway and it would be black and there was no markings anywhere on the runway, and then the light on the side of the runway weren't white, which would indicate that I was on a runway, then I would be thinking, there's something that's wrong here. This has no markings on the runway, which is possible, but then you also have the wrong colored lights on the side of the runway. So if I was the first officer and the captain were to line me up on that runway and be like, yes, this view is great, like he's getting ready to take off, I'd be like, what are you doing, bro? This is definitely not the runway we should be taking off from. You would think that if they were going to make a movie named Plane, that they would at least have some input from a pilot. I don't know if they got one, but if they did, they should get their money back. Next, we need to talk about this part right here.
80. Cross checks. 90. 100. 110. 120. V1.
There is one main call out that most airlines do, and that's the 80 knots call. And they'll check and verify. And the reason is to verify that your indicators and all the things that are on the ground while your plane is moving is indicating correctly. You're getting proper airspeed on both of the inputs that are coming into the flight deck. Because if you have one side that maybe has a blocked tube, which is helping the pilots gauge their airspeed, then you can have problems in flight. So at 80 knots, if that thing is not properly indicating, then you can abort your landing or abort your takeoff at a relatively slow speed there, and you're not running any risk. However, you're not going to then be going 80, 90, 100, 105. You're just not going to be counting that stuff up. You want to make that check, and that's the only thing. The whole thing about takeoff is that you don't want to be saying anything except the very minimum thing, so everybody can be very focused on what they're doing. So you'll get an 80 knot call by one pilot. The other pilot will typically check that. So he's going to say 80 knots. The other pilot might say cross-checked or checked or something. And then they both are basically saying, I'm getting proper reading on my side, and the other one is getting proper reading on his side. So that would be a call that is realistic. So it should sound more like this.
80. Cross checks. V1. Rotate.
The other thing is that there's usually one pilot who's working the radios and one pilot who's flying the plane. And the one who's flying the plane is doing his task of safely flying the plane, while the other pilot is handling the radios and all the additional call-outs and all the additional things that need to happen. So you're not going to have a pilot who's working the radios, flying the plane, because then the first officer is over there, I don't know, looking out the window, making YouTube videos. Who knows what he's doing over there, but that's not realistic at all. So this part here where the captain is making radio calls and flying the aircraft is super Hollywood.
Departure, Trailblazer 119.
Another thing that's very Hollywood in here is that the pilot asks for the gear up and then immediately pull the flaps up.
Landing gear up.
Landing gear up. Flaps up. Flaps up.
The flaps are designed to let your plane fly at a slower speed. So just a couple seconds after rotation, you're never going to see the flaps go all the way up, which is the call that he's making. He's saying gear up, and then that's a couple seconds later he says flaps up. If you were to put your flaps up at that slow of a speed because the plane hasn't accelerated yet, then you have a very high risk of stalling your aircraft and crashing just seconds after takeoff. No pilot is ever going to do that if they want to live. So that is very Hollywood. So far, pretty much everything here is very Hollywood. I just can't understand how you can title a movie Plane and then have no input from a pilot whatsoever. I mean, these are very simple inputs that they could have called up anyone who has basic aviation knowledge, worked at an airline at any time for a year. They would say, this is the basic sequence that it would need to go in, and it would make a movie titled Plane seem a lot more realistic.
Beautiful family.
Thank you. It's a juggle, but we make it work. How about you, Cap? Do you have a family?
Yeah, I have a daughter. Actually, here she is. Daniela.
Nope. Nope. 100% nope. This is super Hollywood. Never would you ever see, or have I ever seen anyone do something like that. No pilots are typically showing pictures of their young college-age daughter to the other pilots. Never have I seen that. I've seen it where a pilot might have his family on his phone, like on a screensaver, but I've never seen somebody say, oh yeah, this is my daughter, or had a first officer that I've seen clip their photo of their family onto the yoke. If I saw a first officer do something like this, I would be getting very nervous. I'd be thinking, what are you planning to do? Like, why do you need to put them there on the yoke? That yoke we usually reserve for taking down notes, putting key information for like our flight number, things like that. That's what I keep on the yoke. You are never going to see, I've never seen in all my years, someone put a clip or a photo of their family on that yoke clip there. That makes no sense. It would honestly make me kind of uncomfortable. What are you doing? Why are you putting that there? For obvious reasons, no pilot is going to be showing other pilots his very pretty daughter, because no pilot ever wants to see his daughter dating a pilot. That's like rule number one. That's something that is very true. You will typically never see pilots that have daughters that want their daughters to date pilots. That is something that's very true. So you're not going to show your very pretty daughter to the other pilots because one of them might be like, oh, what's her name? And then start looking her up on Instagram. So I've flown with a lot of guys. Guys will talk about their family. Oh, I got a couple kids, or this, that, or the other thing, but photos is just not something that we typically do. I don't know, it would be kind of weird.
We're cutting right through the top of the storm.
So much for moving inland.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. The seatbelt signs have been turned on. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelt secured. Thank you. Trailblazer 119, requesting climb to 40,000 to clear weather.
What was that?
Okay. Gonna check on the passengers. You have control.
I have control.
First, no pilot or no decent pilot, I'm not even talking about a good pilot, but no decent pilot would ever put themselves in this situation right here. These rings right here indicating the nautical miles away from where the plane is. So I'm suspecting they're saying this is 10 miles and this is 15 miles. So they are basically seconds away from hitting the storm, and this storm is all red, and you would never want to fly anywhere near a solid red wall like this. Typically, you're never going to see that deep of a red blob of clouds. You're typically not going to see that. But what would happen is maybe 40 miles out, 30 miles out, 20 miles out even, pilots will make a call and say, hey, we need to get deviation to the right or deviation to the left. And you'll get clearance from air traffic control to go to the left or right, not above it, because clouds can be growing very quickly. And from the top of those clouds, it could be spitting out ice or who knows what. And there's a lot of air that's getting sucked in those clouds that are growing very fast. So there's a lot of updrafts there. So it's going to be a very rough ride for the passengers. Now, even when I'm flying freight, I've talked about when we're flying freight, we don't care about turbulence. That is true. During turbulence, we just want to stay inside our speed window, which allows this plane to be safe. That's the only thing that we really care about. But when even in this situation where there's a big red blob like that, you would never see the pilots go, we'll just go over it, even though it's going to be a rough ride. You would go to the side of it. No one's ever going to go over the top of something like that. That's that red. The next thing that's very Hollywood is this part.
Trailblazer 119, requesting climb to 40,000 to clear weather.
Most of you know that 40,000 feet, it's even hard for me to say, is flight level 400. So no pilot is ever going to say 40,000 feet, but that's not the part that's really Hollywood. It's this right here. Based on this screen, they're either flying already at flight level 400 or they're going 40,000 knots. And going 40,000 knots is about as realistic as a pilot flying this close to a massively red storm and being 5 miles away and then saying, oh, let's try to climb and go over the top of it. Those are about equally realistic. Also equally realistic is that there's this rough storm that you just went through and then the pilot does this.
Okay. Gonna check on the passengers. You have control.
I have control.
No pilot is going to get up out of his seat to go check on passengers in moderate or severe turbulence, especially when you're still in the storm, because you, as being one of the only two pilots, are going to want to be up there to safely navigate everything that's going on. There has been one circumstance where I did get up after some very rough turbulence, and that was because we hit the turbulence from another jet. We were in a smaller regional jet. We hit the turbulence from another jet. It was a momentary, maybe half a second amount of turbulence that shook the ceiling panels off of the ceiling, and they were hanging down. So I called back after that. We were maybe at like 4,000 or 5,000 feet when that happened. So everybody was seated, thankfully. I'm sure they were very nervous after that happened. But I called back to the flight attendants after we got through 10,000 feet. And I said, hey, what's going on back there? What does it look like? And she said, well, some of the ceiling panels have come down. I said, okay, just give me a second. Just leave everybody in their seats and I'll be back in a second. And the reason that I did that in that circumstance was because the ceiling panels were hanging down. So in the event that there was going to be a problem, I wanted to make sure that we could get those ceiling panels either out of the way or back where they belong in case we needed to evacuate or there was a circumstance like that. And I didn't want to ask the flight attendant, she was kind of short. She was never going to be able to reach the ceiling anyways. So I just said, okay, so we got up to cruise. It was a smooth ride. There was no weather. Then I got up, put the ceiling panel back, and it was no big deal. That's the only time. You would never do it in the middle of a turbulent storm because then if you were to get injured, now you got one pilot down, now you got one pilot up there handling the storm, running the radios, flying the plane. It's just not a good situation.
Listen, keep everybody in their seats, no exceptions, all right?
That is why a pilot is not going to get up in the middle of a storm. You're going to smash your head, you're going to have a concussion, maybe be knocked out. Who knows what's going to happen, but this is the exact reason what I was just saying. You're never going to get up in the middle of the storm because of this situation right here. Obviously, the directors of this movie wanted to have a circumstance where there was blood or injury to the captain. They could have easily done it another way. They could have easily had the captain get up to go to the bathroom, hit some unexpected turbulence, he get thrown around inside the bathroom. That's more realistic. Or they could have been sitting on the flight deck, and then he could have just been a lackadaisical pilot that just was being a little loosey-goosey, if you will, and then didn't wear his seatbelt, and then hit unexpected turbulence. Those buttons that in the overhead panel that are above us, I have hit them as I was getting into the seat before with my head. They're very sharp, they hurt. So if you were not wearing your seatbelt and you got thrown up into that with unexpected turbulence, that's going to give you a lot of blood on your face. So those are two scenarios that you could have accomplished the exact same thing that would be a lot more realistic than getting into the middle of a thunderstorm and then walking back and then talking to the flight attendant saying, hey, make sure nobody gets up, no exceptions. Well, you're also kind of key part of this thing, Captain. You should be in your seat, no exceptions.
I have control.
Copy that.
Check breakers and reset.
Resetting.
TSN, this is Trailblazer 119. Do you copy? Avionics must be fried. Is anyone on this channel? Please respond. Trailblazer 119, flying blind. Lightning strike. Avionics down. We are dark. Does anyone have our position?
Radio's dead. Resetting. System failure. We're not transmitting.
One straight battery. That gives us 10 minutes to put her down before we lose power. Drop an uncontrolled descent.
Oh, apparently these planes are running on batteries now. I guess that's the reason why he said this.
One straight battery. That gives us 10 minutes to put her down before we lose power. Drop an uncontrolled descent.
Now, every plane is different, and in this movie, they seem to want to use the parts and pieces of different planes. I don't know why when they make a movie, they can't just pick a plane type and then use all the parts from that plane, but whatever. Anyway, they're going to pick in different pieces, so I don't know the electrical systems of this random made-up plane that they're using, but typically planes will have multiple electrical systems. Planes do need electrics, that is true. We do have batteries, that is true, but there's usually multiple systems, and those systems are typically, historically, not going to all fail at once from a lightning strike. Also, on the lightning strike, the plane has a protective thing around it, so that way if it does get struck by lightning, it dissipates and spreads out through the whole plane. So a lightning strike, while scary, was not a big deal. It's not a high risk. The planes and obviously the engineers have thought about this scenario since you're flying around possibly near thunderstorms. So it's not a major risk to have a plane get a lightning strike. It happens all the time, actually. But if you did have an electrical system fail because of the lightning strike, usually maybe one would fail, not both would fail. And if both failed, you do have a backup battery system, but that doesn't impact your engines at all. So you would never see a scenario like this where one lightning strike turns this entire plane dark like this. Those battery packs are used for things like lighting up the emergency lights and the aisleway or the signs. Those things are going to be lit up. It's never going to be all black. And they're also going to power, typically, things on the captain's instrument panel. So that way he's able to or she's able to safely land the aircraft. So you're not going to see it where they're just all dark, all the radios have gone, everything has failed, and there's no lights anywhere on the plane. That's just not realistic in that scenario. You're going to have lights somewhere, some basic. So they have like different tiers of systems. So if you go all the way down to the system of everything has failed and you're just on battery, the captain is going to have obviously a limited time because of the situation with it being batteries. It can't go forever. It's not going to be getting recharged in this situation because all the electrical systems are down. So I'm guessing the generators are also down that are coming off of the engines. But here's the thing to know. These engines, once they get going, these turbine engines, which is what they're flying on, once those engines get going, they do need electrical spark to get the fire and everything going to get the engine to do what it's supposed to do. But once that starts, doesn't really need anything unless the engine were to flame out. So this 10-minute situation that he was saying right here.
One straight battery. That gives us 10 minutes to put her down before we lose power. Drop an uncontrolled descent.
your response if you were flying with them would be, no sir, I do not want to go ditch this plane into the middle of the ocean and go try to land there, because you have two working engines. Even though you're in a storm and you maybe lost everything, your engines are still going to work. Now, every plane is different as far as how much control you're going to have if you were to lose all of your systems. So, for example, you will still have things controlled where the plane is still able to be controlled with the throttle for the power, and that's just going to control how much fuel is going into your engine, so you're going to be able to control that. And then you might have something like, you don't have the typical amount of ability to bank your aircraft. You might have to use some type of a trim to do it, so it's going to be slower, but you will be able to do the very basics while you get your plane figured out again. Every plane is different, so again, this is multiple different planes. I don't know which system they're using, but I will tell you that in the situation where you lose all your electrical systems, your plane is still going to be able to fly fine, and your pilots hopefully will never say, okay, we've lost everything, let's just go ditch this thing in a storm, in the ocean, at night. That's terrible. And he keeps calling on the radio like this.
Is anyone on this channel? Please respond. Trailblazer 119 flying blind. Lightning strike. Avionics down. We are dark.
But he also knows that the avionics are down, so doesn't make sense why you would be making radio calls if you know all the avionics are down. It's really stupid. Now, you saw that they had iPads. Now, typically, this is not always the case, but typically those iPads are set up so that way you can track your location. You've seen maybe in some of my vlogs where you'll see the plane moving around while we're going across the middle of the ocean. That's not from some Wi-Fi on the ground. That's just because the GPS is set up in that iPad that allows me to see where I'm at. It's just an additional resource. We don't use it for navigation. It's not an official navigation source, so don't think of it like that. But in this scenario where you have lost everything and you are now in the situation where everything has gone dark, your batteries have run out, I guess, and now there's no instruments and you're just flying at night with the power and whatever controls your plane would have, you should have that iPad, which would allow you to figure out where you are in the world. And you would look down at that iPad and go, okay, well, we're over the middle of the ocean. There's land over here. Let's start making our way there and then find an airport. Now, obviously, a busy airport where you're flying without any lights on your plane at night, there's a lot of risks there, but better that than having a situation where you're trying to ditch your plane at night in the water. No pilot is going to choose that as their first option. They would just look down at their iPad here and say, hey, there's an island over here. Let's fly to that island and go try to land there. So far, the only two things that are realistic is that there are two pilots up there and they have the appropriate amount of stripes on their epaulets. So far, that and then the bickering. That's pretty crazy to be this deep into a movie and really 99% of everything that they've put up, there was a solution to accomplish the exact same thing, but they came up with an idea that just made no sense at all. And I don't understand it, because despite guest starring in one of the most successful Hollywood movies ever,
and you shall be dead.
Nobody ever calls me to ask me what we can do to make these movies more realistic. I've seen enough of this movie, I don't think it's going to get any more realistic. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.